right. So the whole session today, we're focusing on the financial part of it and the roadmap to that self-sustainability. And I need to be able to forward the slide. There we go. At the University of Minnesota, we'd like to start all of our sessions with recognition, specifically the land acknowledgement that Minnesota is on the rightful homelands of the Dakotas and other indigenous peoples. We recognize that the U.S. did not uphold its end of the land treaties, and it's the continued displacement of indigenous peoples that allows the state of Minnesota to exist today. We also have an affirmation of commitment at the Institute on Community Integration. We are committed to address systemic racism, ableism, and all other inequities and forms of oppression to ensure inclusive communities. Last week, we kind of had more of a top-end discussion in terms of high quality inclusive higher education, meaning our Minnesota standards and the other key components. We encourage you to look at the resources that were shared out this morning, as well as continue to attend our webinars, reach out to us with any questions so that you can gain more insight and be confident in understanding high quality inclusive higher education. Today, again, we're focusing more on the financial framework and how to get to planning and offering a self-sustaining initiative. And there's sort of three different areas that we're going to touch on. The competitive grant, that's coming up this spring. And there is a requirement for a project grant budget. It's 1 year because it's linked directly to the competitive grant. The second component that we're going to talk about today, and this is to me, the most important part, is that 10-year financial roadmap, meaning the plan to how you're going to get to being self-sustaining, that long-term planning of the initiative. And we'll go over an example of a budget template that we'd like to share with you so that you can take it back to your institution and then customize it specific to your institution and the demographics and cost structure that you have. And the third piece, and Stephanie, this would be probably of most interest to you, is how do we establish that the initiative to be financially accessible, not only in terms of what the tuition and fees, the revenues are going to look like, but how and what can the students access to help pay for college. So we're going to start out with the competitive grant funding. This slide here has a summary of what was passed through our legislature in 2023. There is competitive grant funding that's available, and the way the law is written, they are 1-year grants. They have a 25% match that's required either in kind or monetary by the institution. As a college or university that's eligible, you're able to reapply annually for up to 10 years. And then I've got on there the list in terms of the maximum amount that's available to any one institution in a given year. You are allowed to use that first year as a planning year, meaning not having to have students on campus right off the bat. We think that's really important to be intentional and really plan things out before you have students on campus. And then the whole intent of the competitive grant funding is think about it as your startup costs. You're going to take a few years to ramp up your enrollment to that self-sustaining level. And the intent of that competitive grant was to cover that gap so that you don't have a deficit. And then in the competitive grant, the RFP, this is sort of the framework for what you'll be required. I don't think the Office of Higher Ed is going to change this in any way, but you will be required to submit a 1-year grant budget with your application. It's a pretty basic, and And when we get to the 10-year, this in essence, you can determine it using that 10-year budget template. They need to match basically that first year of the template and your grant application. And I'd like to turn it over to Shayna.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mary. So quick context for you all of why I'm speaking to this, given that I'm not in your state. As I mentioned, I'm coming from Colorado. My organization is called Pathways to Inclusive Higher Ed, and we support all of the inclusive higher education programs that exist throughout the state of Colorado. And one of the big things that we've experienced over the past few years is providing legislative grant funding to developing inclusive higher education programs. So we've gone through these slides with several institutions. We've kind of gone through the budgeting process. I think what's really important is as we just think about you're wanting to start an initiative, and I'm hearing from all of you, you have the heart and the passion behind it and the right motive. And it's really important, as you guys know, working with your admins and anybody else on campus, that you also have to have clarity of, your cost and your revenues and what this is going to bring to the institution. Your numbers have to match it in order to make this a possible initiative at your institution. So what I want to do is kind of present to you like a perspective that I want you to have as you're thinking of proposing this to your institution and submitting an RFP. You want to, be able to show that self-sustaining, that you're not going to be constantly reliant on grant funding. There are lots of higher education programs like TRIO that they're reliant on that every single year. But the way that we advise higher education, inclusive higher education programs, is that you build in revenue streams so that you can be sustainable and not reliant, so that you can continue serving this population because they continue to have the need. So we want you to think of that like long-term, how can I make this really viable? And then also we want you to think, when we're talking about this financial roadmap or this 10-year budget, think about how can you show your administration the value add to your institution. This is an untapped population of students, typically for the institutions that you're working with, new revenue into the institution. And so that's a really important thing to highlight when you guys are going to be looking at your 10-year budget. This isn't just a program that's going to drain an institution. It's going to add revenue and it's going to add value in a lot of different ways. So that's kind of my plug before I get into the nitty gritty of these slides. And Mary, feel free to hop in at any point. But this first slide is just kind of a reminder, right, that any program that exists in a higher education institution has typical costs and revenue streams. And so some of these on the far left is going to be your traditional costs. Some of these are going to be costs that you're going to experience with an inclusive higher education program as well. Things like materials, instruction materials, facilities, specific equipment and technology, things like that. But a lot of those might already exist at your institution and won't be specific costs to your program. And so this is going to be very individualized to each institution. But I want you to start by thinking of just kind of that normative process for any program development at your institution. What are those typical costs that come up? And then on the right side is your traditional revenue. How do we kind of make up those costs? And that's tuition from students. It's very common to have programmatic fees for specific programs that exist on campus, and tapping into additional funds like state or grant funding. So that's pretty normal. If we can switch to the next slide, I want to point out the things that are going to be unique about the funding model for an inclusive higher education program. First, you're going to see this staffing, and I do want to point out the incremental cost of this. So when we are developing this 10-year plan, it is not expected that you request the fullest amount in that first year and you have a full staff before you even have students on campus. That's not a wise use of funding. And so we really want people to think incrementally about developing this program over time. And so ideally, what we've experienced in Colorado, that first planning year, it's really dedicated to hiring one development staff, maybe 1.5, where you're doing the work in the institution to really put the systems in place to be ready for students, but you don't need to have a full 3-person staff. But it is important to know, as you get into the full program development, the type of staff that's going to be either required for this particular RFP or just for program success in general. So you'll see here the recommended staff, and Mary, you can hop in if there's requirements here that I'm unaware of, is to have somebody dedicated to academic support and coordination. So that's going to be somebody that's working with each student, enrolling them in the courses, supporting their faculty, all of those pieces. That takes a big chunk of time, and that's a big part of this program. Then we also advised to have a staff member dedicated to job development and placement, where you're working both on campus and in the community to develop inclusive job settings for students. And then another staffing need that is unique to inclusive higher education programs are peer mentors. We're going to talk a little bit about how you can be creative with that so that it's not a huge cost to your budget, but peer mentors are, truth be told, like the lifeblood of really successful inclusive higher education programs. We want these programs to be as normative as possible. So we don't want staff members going into classes with students, and we don't want staff members going to fraternity parties, right? And so peer mentors are a worthwhile investment for your program so that they're going with students to support them in all areas as organically as possible. And then residence life. So if you have an on-campus living option, having dedicated staff to support students and inclusive living practices is really pivotal. And so those are those staffing pieces that we really want you to think about and creatively or incrementally, excuse me, build up that team so that you're serving your students fully. Go ahead.
Yeah, Shayna, there is one thing that I'll just jump in and underscore or emphasize. One of the things that we have learned talking with colleagues across the country is some of the first initiatives were just excited to be on campus and have the students on campus. And one of the things that was more of an afterthought and was harder to put in place after the fact was the commitment to the employment and the job development. So we're learning basically from the people that have gone before us. And as part of the Minnesota standards, we really want that commitment from the beginning for that employment component, because that is part of the course of study and the requirements for students to earn the certificate. So thanks, Shayna.
Yeah, and you'll see another note about potentially an admin or support that may or may not be needed for programs based on how you guys are structured. I will note from our most recent grantees, the way that we have seen this happen, and this kind of goes back to the in-kind 25% in-kind or monetary match that's required for that competitive grant. A lot of our institutions have identified one faculty member or department chair that's kind of the like overseer champion of the program development that will then hire somebody to do these things like academic development and job development. But they are kind of this in-kind donation because their salary is not coming out of the grant itself. And so that was really, I think, pivotal for the development of these programs, to have one champion that already exists at the institution that already wants to put some effort and time into this, but then we'll build up the team that they need. And then on the flip side, the revenue that is unique to these programs. So students are going to be taking classes with their peers. It's inclusive in nature. And so they're going to be paying the same tuition. And so what we encourage and what we encourage you to just think creatively and collaboratively with your campus is how to partner with your campus to identify a portion of that tuition that goes back into your program budget. So that could be tuition sharing or revenue sharing. That takes lots of conversation and building up awareness of the value add of this to your campus, but that's a really wonderful way to do it. Most programs have a dedicated program fee that families pay, students pay to pay for all of the services that you're going to provide, because you're providing additional services that the institution doesn't currently provide. And so that program fee is normative for these programs, but finding the right amount to charge students to make it accessible, but to make it sustainable is a challenge, but a good one to have. And then utilizing this competitive grant, knowing that you can apply for it up to 10 years, but may not have it for up to 10 years, may not need it for up to 10 years. So even thinking critically about what you put in your budget there. And then there also is some federal options or even external grants that you could find in your communities to support this work. The TIPSID grant is an opportunity that exists, I mean, to my understanding, every year for schools to apply for. Mary, I don't know if you want to share a bit about that as an opportunity.
Yeah, sure. The TIPSID is the federal grant funding that's through the Higher Education Opportunity Act. It's actually 5-year grant funding. If there's so much uncertainty right now with the new administration and what's going to be continuing or not, but there would be a potential for an RFP for the TIPSID grant funding this spring, and it would be funding that would be effective. And they link it to the federal budget year, which starts October 1st.
Thank you. We can go to that next slide for me. So what we're going to do in a little bit is we're going to open up that 10-year financial example. It's just a budget example for you all to kind of start thinking through these variables, but there's a important like mental space to be in when you're plugging in numbers into the spreadsheet. And so I just want to speak to this first before we really look at that spreadsheet. One is thinking of what is actually the right capacity of students to serve. I have worked with a few institutions that, dreamed of serving 40, 100 students, which exist in some places, but they have a huge staff and they had huge support to get that off the ground. And that was something that was a part of their culture and their community. We've also worked with really rural communities and community colleges where they are serving 20. And that's really going to be their max. And so you have to think with your team, what's the right capacity of students, considering what's your staff to student ratio. That's not only going to keep you sustainable and bringing in that income, but also ensure that you're providing good services and good programmatic support to your students. And so that's something to consider. Sometimes we can bump up all the numbers and just see our students climb on the spreadsheet we're about to show you. And then we have to pare that back down to actually say, hey, what's feasible for the staffing that we have and the culture that we have on campus. And then the flip side of that is how many students at minimum will you need to be self-sustaining? So that's kind of like two sides of the same coin that you have to consider as you're looking at your budget. And then really what is the right balance? We don't want to, serve a ton of students, but have this skyrocketing program fee where it's really not accessible to all students. And so that's going to have to come into play as you think about what's going to be the most accessible way to make this possible for students in our community. How can you be creative with partnerships on your campus and really getting buy-in across departments to see how you can collaborate to make this a self-sustaining, feasible program. Go ahead and next slide for me. So these are some of the things we've already chatted about, but just to see it in a list view, some of the things that are going to be variable that you're going to likely, if you take this example budget, we want you to shift and plug and chug and see what works for your institution. So that first one is going to be the number of enrolled students. That's at the top of the spreadsheet that we'll see in just a bit. That's just really important to see, how much is coming in and how many students you can actively serve. The tuition that's coming into the institution versus tuition that's coming to the program. And that's going to take some connection and collaboration across campus to say, hey, how can we get a percentage of these tuition dollars that go to all of these courses that our students are taking to funnel back into our program? And really, again, proposing this as a really value add to the institution can really help with that conversation. And then that program fee, you can change that up and see what's possible and how that impacts your overall budget, and then potential grant funding. And then your expenses that we encourage you to shift around and consider is your staffing. How many staff you have, ensuring that you're meeting those expectations of academic support, job support, and on-campus living support. And then peer mentors. What I will say to this for peer mentors, the variability here is some of my programs that I work with, they pay peer mentors just straight out of their program budget. And it's a big budget for peer mentors. A lot of our most successful and most sustainable budgets, they pay their peer mentors via work study. And so that limits your pool a little bit with who applies for positions, but that's a great way to not have a direct impact to your budget. And then we also have a few programs that work specifically with departments on campus, and they offer peer mentorship as like an internship or a practicum that does not charge the program, but the student gets credit within their program to work with students in the inclusive higher education program while on campus. And that has been such a mutual benefit, and building partnerships with those departments to strategize that could be really valuable. That has really given a strong pool of applicants for the schools that we work with that have done that.
Yeah, the only thing I'll interject here, Shayna, is you really have to look at your campus and the demographics on your campus, right? Because depending on your student population that you have already, they may or may not have capacity, for example, to volunteer, where they may need to be working in order to help pay for their own college. So that's going to impact what you're able to do in terms of those peer mentor positions and the students that you can attract to them.
Yeah. I will also say, I'm going to bump back up to that initiative staffing. Another example that I've had with some programs is they've shared staffing costs with the Disability Services or Accessibility Office, because they determined, our office would be navigating services for these students as best we could without the staff person, but now the staff person is involved. So it's kind of reducing the caseload of their accessibility staff. And so they justified paying for either all or a portion of the program director. And that has been a really great partnership. So I love, Christian, that you're here and that you're thinking from that lens of how your office already can be a part of this initiative, because I think those are really pivotal partnerships. And then when it comes to on-campus living support, there are a variety of ways that you can do this. Some campuses have, identified like an RA that already exists as an RA, but they train them up specifically to support the students. And that way that is already covered, that they're receiving, their room and board covered by Residential Life. Some programs have to hire specific residential assistants that what comes out of their budget instead of hourly pay is the cost of their room and board. And that tends to be a really good support as well. We've also had just strategic peer mentors where they have regular check-ins in residential halls to be supportive. And then the program offers direct training to the residence life staff so that they all feel equipped to support students in a general sense. And then those peer mentors come in that are already trained to work with them on a like day-to-day basis, but not necessarily overnight basis. And so there's some creativity with that as well, based on your campus culture and what your residence life culture is already like, and maybe your relationship with them. And so those are some creative ways to think about staffing that and reducing the impact on your budget. Mary, would you add to those at all?
No, that's good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think what's going to be the most helpful is probably just jumping into this example budget. This is a similar template to what we utilize in Colorado. And it just kind of gives some visual to what we're talking about. But I do want to emphasize that this is not a prescription for every single program. This is just a good way for you to conceptualize some of the variables and think a little bit more critically. But we encourage people to really plug and chug and make some changes to this that fit your institution and fit your vision for the program financial model that you have.
Yeah. Thank you, Shayna.
Yeah.
Just before we get started, can people let us know how comfortable or familiar you are with Excel or your way around spreadsheets? Is it a thumbs up, not really sure, or yeah, never seen one in my life? All right. Yeah, okay. I have a financial background, so slow me down if I'm absolutely making no sense or speaking some other language. And Shayna is right. This spreadsheet, we took the Colorado spreadsheet. We love our colleagues from across the country because they're willing to collaborate and share resources. So it is helping us. So we took the Colorado template, and then we've customized it for Minnesota. And if you'll notice, when we share this out with you and you open it up, if you look at the very bottom, I think you should be able to see that on your screen. There's two tabs. I've got a 2-year and a 4-year because they're different, right? Because in a 4-year, you're typically going to have the opportunity to offer housing and for students to live on campus. And in a 2-year, a lot of times that's not an option. And so there are some differences between the two spreadsheets. And as Shayna had mentioned, the very beginning we start out with is the students enrolled. And the way we have this set up is hang on just a second, with assumptions that you're not going to start out with 20 students or some big number, right? You're going to start out small and grow it over time. That is the sage advice that we've gotten from all sorts of people from across the country. Some of them learned the hard way, where they put a pile of students on the very first year and really struggled through. And so we want you to be successful from the start small and grow it. And that obviously then impacts your revenue and related expenses. So that's the first section. And when you receive this, a lot of the information is formulas. So you really just need to plug in certain numbers, and those are your variables. Just as Shayna has mentioned, this is purely an example and a template for you to get started and then customize to what makes sense for your specific college or university. So the second part is the income or the revenue. And again, Shayna had kind of talked about that. We have this set up based off of the average costs for Minnesota State. So this is the 10,000 full-time tuition is the average across the Minnesota State system. But again, these numbers are purely in there for example, and you'll need to customize it specific to your institution. So if you look at that column C, those are sort of where you're going to be inputting the variables, we'll call them, and then it'll automatically calculate the total revenue or expense for the year based on the revenue or cost per student. That makes sense. And then it's purely for example, we've just built in a revenue sharing of an 80-20. That is something that you'll definitely have to have conversations and get some sort of an agreement within your institution as whether they are willing to do it or not. And then, what kind of a percentage, if you can reach an agreement. And then this is titled, the next one here is titled the Education Support Service Fee. That's a program fee. Pretty much most colleges and universities that are offering enrollment to students with intellectual and developmental disabilities do have a program fee. That is one way that they're able to cover the costs that are the incremental costs for the additional framework or support that they provide the students on campus. And then if you scroll down into the second section in terms of revenue, we do have a line here for assuming that you're going to apply for the competitive grant. And that you can play around with and plug in that number based on whether it's a planning year or a subsequent year and the number of students you're anticipating having on campus.
And if I can interject here, what has been helpful with a lot of the programs that we've worked with is that first planning year to really request the need of that one program director to get things going. I think that has made institutions feel less daunted, knowing that if you apply for this grant, you at least have the funding to support that one staff person that's going to do the rest of the work. So it feels like it's not a big ask on the institution, and it gives it's kind of this buffer time of, hey, let's hire somebody that's going to make this work happen on our campus without a huge cost to the institution directly. You'll still have that 25% match required. But when you're thinking of amounts, that's really what we've seen is kind of starting small with just that one salary need. And then it bumps up typically in years 2 and 3. And then you start to taper it back out. When you think, I wouldn't recommend just getting a blank number across every single year of that competitive grant. You really want to think strategically of when do I want to onboard another staff person and kind of have that progressive, like a bell curve, starting lower, increasing, and then coming back down.
Yeah. Thank you, Shayna. We've also have built in here, it could be that there's other funding sources that you have access to. There could be a donor, some other kind of grant funding or other type of funding that you can tap into through your institution. And then we're looking at the expenses, and the biggest chunk is going to be, the staffing. Right. So there's incrementally, and again, as Shayna has mentioned, really depends on how you structure it. If it's existing faculty and staff and a portion of their time is allocated to inclusive higher ed, it may or may not be something where the cost of it is responsibility of the initiative. But again, that just sort of depends on how you're structured. We have this built out. If you notice it, with a number of different faculty and staff. And if you look to the right, every year as your enrollment is growing, then you're adding staff, right? Until you get up to whatever sort of your critical mass is in terms of that self-sustaining level that makes the most sense for you as a college or university. And they can have different roles. It doesn't necessarily have to mirror or match this, but you clearly need to have somebody that's got the responsibilities of the wraparound academic support. The employment is extremely important. And then, but sometimes they have it structured in terms of for that independent living. And you can get creative. Shayna, I don't know if in Colorado, any of the colleges and universities have tapped into grad students. I mean, there's all sorts of ways of sort of staffing the initiative that, look at that through the lens of your institution.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. We've had a couple of programs that do tap into grad assistance, specifically surrounding like the social and independent inclusion across campus. UCCS, they have their dedicated employment person, they have their academic person, and then they have an inclusion specialist which focuses on coordinating all of their peer mentors for that social engagement and independent living support. So, and then they have their director is a faculty from the School of Education, and that's kind of where her primary salary is provided from. So I would encourage, especially as you look at this, don't feel like you have to fill all of those initiative staff, line items to make it look like you're building out this huge program. Like a slim staff can be very successful if it's very strategic. So,
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
The second part of the staffing or human resources is the mentors. And sometimes a college or university sets it up where they have a sort of a structure where they have mentors that are providing certain supports, and then they have potentially have coaches, or so they have different levels of really those peer mentors, and they play different roles. Again, it really depends on your campus and what makes the most sense in terms of the student demographics that you have. If you're having to pay them directly, if you can get a cadre of peer mentors that would volunteer, it's really all over the map across the country, where you have some colleges and universities that just have just this huge number of students that want to be peer mentors and will do it on a volunteer basis, and then others, the demographic is such that you really need to and have to plan to pay the peer mentors because they need that in order to support themselves while they're going to college.
Yeah, and you might see on this spreadsheet, you'll see that you might have a variety of that. You may not have all volunteers or all work study. What we have seen is at the community college level, work study is a really high priority, just to give that financial support to the students in need. And so that typically is like a 75% of their peer mentors are work study. And then for some, schools like Bethel, there might be a required, volunteer hours for graduation that might exist, or that might be a requirement for some programs at your institution. And so that's a great thing to tap into. If this is a requirement for some programs, it's building that relationship with that department as an option for their students to plug into. So yeah, just think a little bit, don't feel like it has to be very linear. You can have multiple options, but it really should be in line with the culture of your campus.
Yeah. And then the last component is for residence life. Just as Shayna had suggested, there's all sorts of different ways of organizing and setting that up. I know where my daughter goes to college, the resident assistant on each of the floors has additional training, and they're part of the peer mentor support. They just do it through the lens of that independent living and being in the dorm and some of the social components of that. And then others, where I think isn't it at UCCS where they actually hire and have dedicated resident advisors that are have a focus or responsibility in terms of the students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Yeah. And then the other expenses, just simply that. It's just a way to, again, you'll plug in something there relative to the types of expenses that you might be incurring as part of the initiative.
And just a quick point out for this, one thing to think about, if you are partnering closely with the accessibility office on your campus, they might have the software and assistive technology to serve your first 5 students. And so you may not need really a huge line item for that in that first year. So those are things to consider of how can you tap into resources that already exist on your campus and really make this a collaborative effort.
Yeah. And then one thing that I will say, we will be encouraging you to join our TA Center. We offer an annual conference in the fall, and there'll be an expectation that somebody from your university or college attends that, whether it's in person or virtual. And then there's a national conference that we really want a Minnesota contingent to go to, and it's that's how we know Shayna. And our colleagues across the country. It's this amazing network of people. Hang on, I'm going to run out of battery.
Yeah, and I can speak to that. It's been, they really address big common questions, both from programs that have existed for a long time and programs that are just getting off the ground. So it's a great network to connect with for the duration of your program.
Yeah, it's a fantastic network, and it's just this tremendous resource in terms of the sessions that you're able to attend and the knowledge you're able to tap into. So you don't have to feel alone, right, on your campus or in your state. And I'll pro tip. I mean, that's going to be a requirement of if you're applying for the grant funding that there's a commitment to attend that. And we want that not to be a stick, but to be an incentive for you to really truly become part of the inclusive higher ed community of colleagues from across the country. Do you have any specific questions about the framework? We've got just a few more minutes, and I want to make sure we touch on the student part of financial accessibility before we need to wrap up. Are we good to move on? Okay. I'll bring us back to our slides. Maybe.
I'm happy to do it if that's helpful.
How's that?
Great.
Sorry, it's not letting me. Okay, we're winging it. The key takeaway, what we've been talking about up to this point is from the college or university standpoint of your revenue and expenses. What we haven't touched on is from the student's perspective of how do I pay for this? So is it financially accessible? And what can I do? Or where do I look as a college student for funds? And the key takeaway is that through the federal legislation, your college or university can amend their financial aid application with the U.S. Department of Ed and earn that CTP designation. And what that does is it opens that doorway so any student with an intellectual and developmental disability that is attending your institution through the Inclusive Higher Ed Initiative is eligible for federal financial aid. That's the Pell Grants, the other grants, work study. It does not include loans. That's one thing that they're not eligible for is the student loans. And in Minnesota, we are fortunate because the students if they're a Minnesota resident, they're attending a Minnesota college or university with that CTP designation, they're also considered and eligible for all of the state financial aid. And that includes the North Star Promise for if they're attending a Minnesota public university or college. So think about it, they're really a college student, and their funding options are the same as any other college student. And then secondary to that is there are social service funding streams that they may have access to. Vocational rehabilitation or voc rehab funding. And there are ways to link the job goal and college, and then voc rehab funding is available. And there's federal guidance letters that state just that voc rehab can be utilized to help fund for the college education. And then waiver funding is another possibility. A lot of times that can be used for some of the daily living or the support needs that a student might have on their campus. In Minnesota, that's really on an individual basis. There isn't any kind of a statewide sort of agreement. Some states do have that. Minnesota does not. And Minnesota's in the process of reforming their waivers. And so there's a little bit more uncertainty associated with that. And with that, we're really at the point of asking if you have any questions or comments that you would like to address before we finish up.
Mary, did you also address the IDD grant in Minnesota?
Right. So thank you, Katie.
Yeah.
As part of the college financial aid through the state of Minnesota, Minnesota did pass a law around 2015. So there is specifically a state grant that's available for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Again, they have to be a Minnesota resident attending a Minnesota college or university with that CTP designation. And then they're automatically eligible for that grant. There's a formula. It's not a needs-based. You just simply have to have a documented, identified intellectual disability and then meet that other criteria, and you will receive a portion of that grant funding. It's like they have $200,000 per year that's available for all the Minnesota students with IDD that are attending Minnesota colleges or universities.
And I would just add, so the CTP designation that Mary is talking about, that's the Comprehensive Transition Program. And what for staff that are trying to start an initiative, essentially, they're going to work closely with their financial aid office. The financial aid actually submits that amendment via their typical form process, saying this is a new program being added to our institution that should qualify for financial aid. And the differences on that program is that it's an alternative admission process for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, receiving supports in academics, social engagement, career development, and independent skill development. So it's really the bones of your program already. It's just putting it on a formal application and sending it to the Department of Education to say, see, we're going to do this for these students. And they say, that's really valuable. They're going to be fully included and they're going to be full-time students. We're going to give you the CTP designation, and that gives them access to financial aid. So.
And then I'll piggyback off of that. Stephanie, if you attend the MAFA conference, we did present last spring and talked about that, as well as we just submitted with the Office of Higher Ed to co-present again this year. So we'll be talking more specifically to that, the conference this spring. And then last week we shared out some of the resources through Think College. That's the National Technical Assistance Center. And they really have a whole online module to help walk you through specifically what you need to do as an institution to get ready to apply for that CTP designation, but also the steps to be able to do that. So there's some really good resources so that you don't have to feel like you're having to figure that out completely on your own.
So to me, it sounds like, and I think Maya, you have this at your school, is that right? So to me, it sounds like it's just a matter of once the certificate is developed, submitting it through our participation agreement to Department of Ed, with some different designations, as Shayna indicated, and getting that approved, basically. So that would be our part of the process.
Yeah, I mean, there
And
are,
processing. I'm curious, is there any like reporting requirements or anything for financial aid on the back end of tracking these students? I mean, we would certainly have to track them to keep from processing loans. We would have to identify them either in a cohort or whatever, but
yeah. Yeah, I mean, and obviously they have to meet certain standards like any other college student, right? The SAP, because there needs to be a SAP developed specifically for the credential that they're earning. And that's part of all of that is sort of part of the documentation that's required. And in one way or another, it becomes part of the submission to amend your financial aid application with the U.S. Department of Ed.
Yeah, and what I would say, Stephanie, really the program leads at your institution is going to put all of that information together. It's going to be them outlining all of the ways that they provide that, and it's giving that to you to say, hey, can you submit this on our behalf, essentially. So it's there's going to be some collaborative work, but it's really the program staff or that dedicated staff person saying, here's the breakdown of all the ways we're serving these students within this program. And a lot of our institutions, based on whatever credentials offered to these students, that's kind of their indicator to financial aid, and to the registrar, that they're this group of students receiving these types of federal aid and any other notation that you guys require. But it should be fairly simple on the financial aid side of things once the program staff gets all.
And I would assume that this certificate in its development goes through our accreditation.
Yes.
So, which would be a normal process for us before we would add anything to our participation agreement.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the requirement.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
But going back to what we talked about last week with the certification of it, students can identify what they want their majors to be. Do we have to have those certificates outlined ahead of time of what that would look like for them? Like, I was under the understanding that that would be kind of a plan we would make with students as they designated what they wanted their major to be. So what would we give to Stephanie to say, this is what we're going to do? Like, how does that, I got a little gap in that part.
I think it depends on how you structure it. But you certainly want that flexibility. You're going to have core courses that are probably going to be a requirement, right? And then it's what I like to describe as those upper level classes are the specialization in terms of the specific area that student wants to pursue their certificate in. And depending on what you decide as an institution, just an example, Millersville University in Pennsylvania, they have, it's actually a degree and it's called integrated studies. And then there's flexibility within that degree so that the student takes those core courses, but then the upper level courses in their specific area of interest. So they're like their concentration. I mean, another example I'll give you is my daughter is attending a 4-year. She's working on a 3-year certificate and has required classes that are her core classes. And then all of her, I'll describe them as the upper level, are in graphic design and photography.
If I could share this with you, this is just a tangible example of one of our program certificates.
Thank you.
So, yep. So they identify those required courses that are already in your catalog, and then they just note the remaining credits are going to be in their area of study. And so we've named this the Comprehensive Higher Education Certificate. So it's kind of more of a broad title for your certificate, and then they can identify their area of study once they go through person-centered planning with the staff. So this is just kind of like it's very bare bones, going through the same certificate process as any other certificate at the institution.
And Shayna, is that what you're using trying to use statewide?
Yeah.
So that you've got a
similar code.
recognizable credential across the state?
Yeah,
for
that has been a
students?
value, that we've used the same kind of title, same kind of coding in the community college system and all of those things. There's nuances across each campus, but by and large, it's a very similar outline so that there is continuity, and more recognition.
Thank you.
That's
Does
something, can we include that in some of our information that we have?
Happy to.
That
Yep.
would be great.
Yeah, we'll share that out in our follow-up email.
Great.
That'd be great.
And we're gonna spend that's a good lead in for next week's session. Next week is on that course of study. But we'll share this out this week, so you have that right away.
Stephanie, I just want to really thank you for being here and helping navigate this piece that I can't even balance my own checkbook, so I don't want to know about any of this. So,
Well, can I just ask one other question too, that it just piqued my interest because you
Absolutely.
mentioned, satisfactory progress, and because these students are receiving federal aid, are they subject to the same satisfactory progress requirements already established by the school? And therefore, if they were to receive federal aid, they'd also be subject to return of Title IV funds?
Good question. I can jump in on that, Mary, if you're happy to.
Yeah,
So
go
part of
for
the
it.
CTP is a CTP specific SAP. So it's going to have the bare bones of they're going to have to meet a GPA requirement and like a minimum completion rate. But then there's additional pieces saying that they're going to accomplish X, Y, and Z in social engagement and all of those pieces. So it's similar, but it's unique to the CTP program. So that is really pivotal, so that they don't have to follow those rest of those regulations.
Sure. And is that kind of like a kind of a standard, or is that developed individually as these programs are created at schools?
There is like a set guidance.
Is there a different standard or set guidance for
There's
the
a set
staff of
guidance
this
that we would
program?
get from Think College that, there's an example that most of our schools take. But what I encourage our schools to do is take that example from Think College, but mirror it next to your institution's SAP and use the language of your institution's SAP for those key pieces like your GPA and your, completion rate. So yeah, but there's a launching pad for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
are they subject to return of funds too? Sorry, just
Say that again.
are they subject to return to Title IV funds if they
I don't
don't
know the
complete
answer
a
to that.
semester where they would have to pay back a portion of federal aid received, proportionate to like how long they attempted the coursework and what the costs were? I mean,
Yeah,
that's every other federal program, so I'm just
My hunch
wondering
for that. Mary, you might have a better understanding.
You know what? That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do know in terms of just from personal experience, my daughter has to show progress. I mean, she has to be and can be put on probation like any other student if she's not making academic progress. And it also for her, in her case, because she also accesses vocational rehabilitation funding, she has to show voc rehab that at the end of every semester that what her academic record is and that she's in good standing and grades and that type of thing. And so that funding is somewhat contingent as well, right? Because if she's just going and having a ball and not focusing on the academic component, then that funding is certainly not something that's going to continue either.
I just have one more question and then I know we're out of time. But so we would have multiple entries for students. So it isn't just this is our plan. We would have this plan and this plan and this plan and this plan that would go into that CPT.
Are you talking, when you say plan, are you talking about course of study?
Yes.
So
I
my advice would be that you identify one general course of study, just like that example, this certificate that has required courses for everybody, and then just that vague area of study, where what you would do is you'd sit down with those students and you say, what areas of study exist on our campus and which courses from these already existing certificates or associates are going to be the most fit for your employment goal. And you'll plug that into their academic plan when they're already enrolled. But that certificate is going to stand on its own with required courses and this amount of credits of what they eventually select for their area.
Yeah.
So
That
that you're really
makes
just creating one.
And you can align it with what you already do for other college students on campus. I mean, that's how my daughter's certificate has been established. I mean, she's really attended 2 different colleges, and those core courses were like any other college student that was on that campus. She was required to take and fulfill those requirements. And then those, what I describe as the upper levels or that area of study, was specific to, and it aligned, in her case, it has aligned with the degree in that specific area.
So it'd really be a good conversation then to talk with like the transfer pathways people to find out what classes students are currently bringing in, what comes from different areas, like, so that those are universal for all our Minnesota system, I think. Like, I don't know.
It could be, I think it's a good conversation to continue next week when we're talking about course of study.
Okay.
Because it's very important.
Yeah, I wanted to get a little grip on what that looked like when we were talking about that plan. So
Yeah.
No, that's a great question. Good thing to be thinking through.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we appreciate that. Thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to having you join us again next week. In between, if you have any other questions, or if you'd like to schedule time to talk further on any topic related to inclusive higher ed, please use the link. You can either email us to set something up, or go right to our Google Calendar and sign up for one of the office hour times. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Great to meet you.
Bye.